All right, now that you know all the etiologies of anterior pituitary hypofunction, let's illustrate what happens to the body when each of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gets knocked out. Posterior pituitary dysfunction is a whole nother beast, with free water and kidneys and PPs and the like. So we'll briefly cover it in this sketch. But posterior dysfunction will be covered in greater detail at the end of the chapter. Now remember, just because your pituitary isn't working doesn't mean the problem is in the pituitary. The hypothalamus is the master controller of the endocrine system. And recall from the last sketch that it's symbolized by the super HYPE press release poster. That's HYPE for hypothalamus. It sits at the base of the brain and sends so-called releasing hormones onto the pituitary, which is why we've highlighted the word release. This then stimulates the pituitary to secrete its own set of hormones, the pituitary being the punching bag-shaped gland that sits underneath. If either of these parts of the endocrine axis gets injured, the hypothalamus or pituitary, that is, then secretion of pituitary hormones diminishes. This is called hypopituitarism. Not surprisingly, the clinical manifestations, diagnosis, and treatment of various forms of hypopituitarism depend directly on which specific hormone is involved. While they can occur in isolation, in most cases, deficiency of multiple hormones occurs, leading to a constellation of symptoms. To make things easier, we'll break down each hormone deficiency individually. Spoiler alert, we'll be going through the anterior pituitary hormones in flat pig order. All right, first up, FSH and LH. Time to get punched in the nads. Okay, stop crouching like that. No one's actually going to touch your gruesome twosome. Look around you. It's only a movie set. And secondly, we're not going straight for the testicles anyways. Decreased FSH and LH cause a secondary hypogonadism. This is different from primary hypogonadism, when the problem originates in the ovaries and testicles themselves. This will be an important theme that comes up throughout this sketch, actually. So we have it illustrated in the back. Over on the primary set, that kid socking the boxer in the Mike and Ikes represents a primary endocrine disorder. Primary hypogonadism, to be exact. Caused by a deficiency in the gonads themselves. Think actual sperm or ovum malfunction, but it could be any endocrine organ not working. Primary hypothyroidism, primary adrenal insufficiency, etc. When it's the end organ malfunctioning, it's a primary disorder. These end organs are normally responsible for providing negative feedback to the hypothalamus and pituitary above. So in the setting of dysfunction, the hypothalamus increases its secretion of releasing hormones. This stimulates the pituitary to increase its own hormones, as depicted by the uppercut elevating that pituitary punching bag. Together, the hypothalamus and pituitary try, in vain, to wake up the organ that's not working. On the contrary, this sketch is dedicated to secondary disorders, when it's the pituitary itself that's malfunctioning. Due to a tumor, let's say. In this case, both the pituitary hormones and the hormones released from the corresponding target organ will be low. With no more negative feedback on the hypothalamus, expect all those initial releasing hormones to remain elevated. But there's no waking up the pituitary. It's done. For example, a pituitary tumor that causes decreased FSH and LH release will cause a corresponding decrease in testosterone production from the gonads. This is called secondary hypogonadism. So, without further ado, let's get right to it. Secondary hypogonadism is caused by decreased follicle-stimulating hormone and/or luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. In fact, in the setting of a pituitary adenoma, when that tumor starts pressing on the gland, it's usually the FSH and LH-producing cells that are affected first. So expect these hormones to become deficient before any of the others. In this scene, FSH and LH are symbolized by the flower-stimulating fertilizer and luteinizing greenhouse lamp. Don't worry, we'll get into an absurd amount of detail on FSH and LH in the repro unit. For now, just know that FSH is like a fertilizer that lets the follicles in the ovaries grow, while LH is like a spotlight that shines down and chooses a single follicle to fully bloom. Rupture, in other words, and release an ovum. Well, Braden, the intern, who's not even supposed to be on the set right now, has decided to knock them over. Frickin' Braden. In women, hypogonadism leads to a deficiency in estrogen. hence the scattered female symbol flowers. This leads to premature ovarian failure, which looks like early menopause. Just hitting the pause button a little too early. Women will experience amenorrhea, infertility, vaginal atrophy, and hot flashes. With prolonged hypogonadism, there's a steady reduction in breast tissue and bone mineral density. In men, lack of testosterone leads to impotence and infertility. Notice some of those scattered flowers look like male symbols, see? That's our symbol for low testosterone. What I really want you to notice, though, is how floppy that boom mic is. Just not performing to its usual standards. To diagnose hypogonadism in men, both serum testosterone and LH are measured. Remember, if you see low testosterone but elevated LH from the pituitary, think primary hypogonadism. That's a testes problem. However, if you have both low testosterone and lower inappropriately normal LH, you're looking at secondary. To diagnose secondary hypogonadism in children, look for two features: no signs of puberty by age 14 in boys or age 12 in girls, and low FSH and LH levels. At Sketchy, we represent the absence of secondary sexual characteristics with that X'd out smiley face shirt. Those two X's, of course, crossing out the areas where breast tissue should be developing. In women and men, treatment is estradiol and testosterone replacement, respectively, if there's no desire for fertility. If fertility's the goal, treatment is with FSH and LH replacement. FSH and LH are crucial for follicle development, remember. Again, this will all be covered in more depth in our repro unit, so stay tuned. Okay, from now on, I promise we'll only be looking at one hormone at a time. Next up is an incredibly important one: adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH released from the anterior pituitary is responsible for controlling cortisol levels. Hence the name, adreno, that's adrenals, cortico, as in the cortex where cortisol is made, and tropic, or change. So we're modulating cortisol levels here. Think of ACTH as a director's clapperboard, telling the adrenals to start doing that whole cortisol thing. 'Cause you can't spell action without act. H. Any disease process that interferes with the normal function of the pituitary gland, thus interfering with ACTH release, will cause a secondary adrenal insufficiency. Decreased ACTH means decreased adrenal stimulation, represented by the yellow cap falling off the director's head over there. You know, 'cause the adrenal is like the hat of the kidney. Needless to say, this causes decreased cortisol levels, symbolized up in the ring by the ripped moon face. Remember, that eerie moon face is our recurring Sketchy symbol for glucocorticoids, like cortisol. The moon face representing the classic moon facies that can occur with steroid excess. No excess today, though. Lack of ACTH and, by extension, cortisol can cause nonspecific symptoms such as weakness, fatigue, and muscle pain. Also, you see those scattered candies? Decreased cortisol can cause hypoglycemia as well, as cortisol normally has a gluconeogenic effect. A feared complication of chronically decreased cortisol is shock. Think of it this way. In the setting of a bad infection, or surgery, or getting punched in the face by one of the cast members, your body normally relies on a boost in cortisol to increase blood pressure and blood sugar in times of stress. Well, in the setting of pituitary hypofunction, ACTH won't be able to increase. This leads to an adrenal crisis, which predominantly manifests as shock. Okay, in general, how do we know this is secondary adrenal insufficiency caused by the pituitary and not primary insufficiency, which involves a malfunction of the adrenal itself? Think Addison's disease, which causes destruction of the adrenal cortex. Well, as we've discussed, ACTH would actually be elevated in the setting of primary adrenal insufficiency because of the loss of negative feedback onto the pituitary. As we'll cover in the next chapter, upregulation of ACTH is tied to increased melanocyte-stimulating hormone and can lead to hyperpigmentation. Just look at that spray tan. Well, in secondary adrenal insufficiency, the pituitary ain't working, resulting in low ACTH, so don't expect to see hyperpigmentation. What else? How about hyperkalemia? In primary adrenal insufficiency, destruction of the entire adrenal cortex means decreased aldosterone as well. Again, this is from the next chapter, but just recognize that smashed mineral crystal as a recurring symbol for decreased mineralocorticoid, aka aldosterone. This leads to increased potassium retention and sodium excretion. Those elevated bananas represent hyperkalemia. Turns out that if the pituitary is at fault, and all you're doing is decreasing the amount of ACTH that reaches the adrenal, mineralocorticoid production should continue uninhibited, as depicted by the mineral crystal held by the movie's main love interest. Think of it as preserved mineralocorticoid function. No hyperkalemia here. ACTH deficiency can cause hyponatremia, though, albeit through a pretty unique mechanism. Lack of cortisol and the corresponding hypotension it generates can lead to increased ADH and free water reabsorption, which subsequently leads to hyponatremia. Yeah, the interplay of the pituitary and adrenal glands is one of the most complex endocrine circuits in the body, which is why their pathways are broken down much further in our adrenal disorder sketch. ACTH deficiency is diagnosed in one of two ways. The most common way to do so is to obtain an early morning cortisol level, since cortisol levels vary with circadian rhythms. A low early morning cortisol with the concurrent low ACTH is indicative of hypopituitarism. But for test purposes, you should know about the metyrapone stimulation test. Even though it's not used as much clinically, metyrapone blocks cortisol synthesis by inhibiting 11-beta hydroxylase in the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex. The reduction in cortisol levels following metyrapone stimulation should produce an increase in ACTH secretion, because of loss of negative feedback on the anterior pituitary. Alas, struggle as she might, this metyrapone makeup artist just can't revive the director. You see, it doesn't matter that you've turned off negative feedback to the pituitary. If the pituitary isn't working, you won't see an increase in ACTH. A negative test, in other words, indicative of secondary adrenal insufficiency. In addition, serum 11-deoxycortisol and urinary 17-hydroxycorticosteroid levels normally rise in response to metyrapone. These are intermediates of adrenal steroid synthesis, and their presence indicates a stimulated adrenal gland. Not when you have a hypofunctioning pituitary and no ACTH, though. So we've made this 17-shaped makeup case an 11-shaped lipstick falling to the floor to represent decreased serum 11-deoxycortisol and urinary 17-hydroxycorticosteroid. Another test used in the diagnosis of adrenal insufficiency is the ACTH stimulation test. You don't actually administer ACTH. Instead, you use a synthetic ACTH called cosintropin. Think of it as not the director, but the co-director.